Last but absolutely not least, Alexander Masters has been at 5x15 before, where he talked about the subject of his first book, which was Stuart, A Life Lived Backwards, and he told us about Stuart, and it was so wonderful, and he told us afterwards about his new book, about the genius in my basement, and he's come to tell us about that now, so please give him a big welcome.
Thank you very much. Before I say anything about it, the full title goes on for a bit. It's The Genius in My Basement, the biography of a happy man. And the man who I'm writing this book about is called Simon, and before I tell you anything about Simon, I want first to tell you how I met him. My first desire in life was to be a mathematician. That's always what I wanted to be. Not pure maths, it was applied maths that particularly interested me. And I took a degree in the subject, and I went on to do an MSc, and then I started doing a PhD in an area of the subject, and it became suddenly very clear to me, as it does to people who are not at heart mathematicians, that I was not terribly good at this subject. And it was, I have to say, and I'm deeply sympathetic to anyone who's gone through this, a horrible experience, because I had great visions. You know, I was going to take over the world and do marvelous things and win all the prizes you could think of. And then it turned out I wasn't even going to do the shadow of a fraction of this. And I felt quite upset about it. And for a while after that, I remember leaving my PhD and the professor calling down the corridor after me, "It's not our fault, it's not our fault." And this burned in my mind for a great length of time. And I went back home and I turned all my maths books round so that the covers were facing the opposite direction. I had, and this is not an exaggeration, I had 10,000 index cards. I found them again recently because I put them away after this disappointment. 10,000 index cards, all aspects of maths and applied maths and so on, which I would study in the hopes that genius would come. It doesn't work before you start buying index cards. Now, it was during this period, after this disappointment with my PhD, I took to doing other things. I drove vans a lot. I started doing writing and got various little writing commissions and things. It's not a lot of money in those little writing commissions, book reviews and so on. And I moved into a room in Cambridge, which was a very shabby, run-down sort of house. But it was a delightful room, and this was in about 1996, 97. And I'd been driving vans for quite a long time, but after my PhD. And I moved into this room, and here was this extraordinary place. There was 2 rooms and a large, large balcony for £35 a week. I mean, it was like a time warp. It was absolutely extraordinary. And I knew a little bit about the landlord who lived in the basement beneath these rooms, that he was a very brilliant man, apparently. He had something to do with mathematics, but no one was quite sure. And whatever it was had gone. He was possibly mad, and he was certainly eccentric. But there was something rather appealing about him, that he seemed to be a type that you often, you know, the dotty character in your village or the down at the end of the street. I mean, he was an unusual type, but I rarely saw him. For the first 6 months or so, I hardly saw him at all. But what I would hear were the noises. He always kept his curtains shut in the basement. So it was obviously quite dingy down there. But I would hear the noises as I was upstairs, and I was working on my first book by this time, and starting to work with in the homeless sector, which is my first book's about that. And I'd hear these noises, and I'd put my ear to the ground, sometimes a little cup, and I could make them out, and there was sort of thump, 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 thwack, crash, thump, thump. And gradually, after a bit, you'd figure out what these were. There was thump, thump, that was him walking. Thwack, crash, that was, he always had a bag, a large sports bag. It was very, very heavy and would sort of make him lean over like this, but he would never let it go. And when he get to the end of his walk, he'd whisk around like that, and this bag would fly out and knock over a pile of books. And that was the crash. And you got this sort of sense of this character down there, but I very rarely saw him. And then there'd be this great big crash, and he'd have gone out the door. And sometimes I'd rush to the window and I'd look out and see him stomping away. Now, I think I have to raise my hand to get pictures. It's rather like being at school, they say. There we go. This is a rather flattering portrait of myself that I decided, after he'd left the building, I decided, well, I'm rather nosy. And so I'd go down into this basement and get a sense of what was down there, what was going on. And these are the steps going down. Now, two of his steps had broken in. And you had to sort of swing over at the bottom to try and get to the light switch because, although not pictured there are all sorts of plastic bags stuffed full of things. And the whole thing was a wreck, basically. Anyway, once we began working on the book, this became a point of contention between the two of us, how I describe his rooms. But they are essential to trying to understand this man, this extraordinary man. Who was this character? So the next one, this is the rooms as he wishes me to portray them. I called it the fiction. And there's my study, that's me lounging about, trying to do some work. And there's my bedroom was at this end. I had the full stretch of the house and the balcony beyond. And he had this bottom bit, that's his bed down in the left-hand corner. And then a back room, which will come important in just a minute. And the next picture, that's the truth. That's what it was really like. And I was going into this room and clambering over these things, and I would look into these plastic bags, Simon still being out. It's not a noble story, how I began this biography. And I looked into the plastic bags, and they were filled, and again, this is not an exaggeration, with tens of thousands of bus timetables. So this was intriguing, because I thought that, I've always been rather interested in those people who carry around lots of bags and full of strange things, newspaper rippings and things. And I've wondered, what is it that motivates? And I wondered if he was one of these people. And that was quite interesting. Oh, anyway, no, stop, go back one. Okay, we'll leave it there if you can't go back one. Anyway, I was wandering through that room. Oh, here we go. And I got to the back room, the bit I pointed out before, and saw this picture. And this is a picture of Simon receiving something from Prince Philip. Well, that was rather extraordinary for a bagman. And I thought, well, I'd better poke around a bit more and see what's going on. So if we go to the next one, I looked on some shelves in that back room and found this. Now, you really have to imagine squalor extending everywhere, a word I'm not allowed to use by Simon's stricture, but it just slipped out. And I looked on the shelf and found this envelope. It's blue. I couldn't find the color one. It was blue. And this is a document. In that document is the announcement of genius. In effect, if you know anything about mathematics, the maths Olympiads are the great triumph of a mathematical mind. They require not a great deal of mathematics. A-level maths is all you need. But they require the inventiveness, the artistry, the sheer bravado of a Newton if you're going to pass these exams. And there's a competition, and they do them all around the world. They were during this period, during the time, this was in the mid-late 60s. During this period, they were held usually in Russia, the Eastern Bloc countries. Now, in maths, not usually, but very often, the most difficult questions are the simplest to express. No, I haven't put this question up, but I looked at the first question, and it was one of these horribly simple questions. It had to do with infinity or the absence of primes. It had to do with all these just words that sent tremors down me of jealousy. And I gave it to a couple of friends of mine who I knew who are mathematicians and professors and things, and said, look, how do you do it? And a couple of days later, one or two of them came back and said, this is how you do it. And most of them didn't really know. This guy in my basement was 15 when he did this, and he did it in 4 lines. And he did it straight off without any thought, and he got in this mathematical competition, he beat countries, not just other people, he beat countries. He was an extraordinary mathematician. Now, if you look, the school's not working. Oh, there we go. So here he is. That's him. Well, second from right, you can figure that out. There he is. This is the competition team, the team that goes to compete in mathematics and represent Britain. They weren't regarded as in it with him. He was the one. This is a man who represented everything I'd wanted to be, and he was living in my basement in this appalling state, or it seemed to me an appalling state, but he seemed nevertheless a very happy, contented man. Where had this capacity of his gone? Now, it turned out, as I found out later writing the biography, that if we go to the next one, that it had begun when he was very, very young. His mother had spotted it when he was 1.5, because he was making patterns in the bricks he built up. Wasn't just throwing, if you go to again, he wasn't just throwing them around like this last character here. He was making little patterns, interesting, intriguing things, and she was very keen on that. By the time he was 4, this was the sums he was doing, 4 and 5, that's sort of when he was good. Apparently, he tells me, if any of you can spot it, there's a mistake in there somewhere. He sometimes had a lapse. That's a rabbit. It's from the same textbook when he was 5. Sometimes had a lapse, but then he quickly got back. Now, what that means is 2 times 2 times 2 in 2s and never stop. Just keep multiplying, multiply, multiply, multiply. About the age of 5, he thought 4 or 5, he got up 2 to the power of 30. And he was interested, so he was good. So we go to the next one. Now, in later life, he got interested in a subject, and it began early. You can see it in his exercise books. He got interested in a subject to do with symmetry, why a square looks the same. So if you rotate a square, it always looks the same. And the same with a triangle. That's his bag. A triangle, you rotate it. Those are, from the symmetry perspective, you might consider them different triangles because one's been rotated, but you can't tell the darndest bit of difference. So there's a mathematics behind that. So triangle before, triangle after looks exactly the same, and it's what goes on above that little error. So if we have, there, I tell you, the maths is very elementary, and I hate to think what my maths teacher would say if he saw me doing this sort of stuff, but you rotate it once and you get a triangle look the same, you rotate it twice and you get rotated. This sort of stuff is what interested him, the symmetry of this. But it was very elementary. It was dealing with, this is kindergarten level mathematics. But it's intriguing that this really, what turned out to be one of the greatest prodigies of the last century, was interested in this sort of juvenile stuff and had found enough in it to derive some sort of mathematics. And I haven't shown you a picture of him yet, but I will now. His feeling about this mathematics and my explanation of it, he often got bored with my attempts to understand. The work he does using these same principles, the same principles that come from the squares and the triangles and so on, that the mathematics you can somehow derive out of this really facile stuff has to do with, it turns out to be essential for cosmology and physics and chemistry. This is a map, believe it or not. So it's mapping, it's a character carrying a map across a landscape. It's very important for mapping. This leads to fundamental mathematics. It appears a lot in those horrible games called Rubik's Cubes and that sort of thing. I've even come across it in one place where it's been used to explain the astral dimension. In symmetry terms, that there has to be a place where you can get ghosts and so on and so forth. This mathematics is fundamental to all sorts of things. And there have been loads of books written about it. That's Simon trying to explain to me something about these books. And, no, don't change it just yet. The thing that he particularly worked on was, I've got 3 minutes. Goodness gracious, how did that happen? I'll forget about that. Now, meanwhile, I said I'd do a biography of him, but he wasn't very good on biography. His brain was completely empty when it came to biographical terms. And meanwhile, I was inviting him to parties a lot, and he would come to these parties, and I always noticed something about it. He sort of had, I was worried about this, but he had these sort of hunched shoulders, and he would always bring a timetable, because the timetable meant he could pounce in on a conversation if it had to do with something to do with a bus route or a train route. And then having started this conversation, he would suddenly walk off without saying goodbye. I wanted another biographical subject after I'd finished my first book. And I thought, well, I can't just take another homeless person. There were a number who would do. But the point was, I was interested in writing about people I knew who I felt not just you would learn about their lives, but that in learning about their lives, they would teach you something about your own. This seems to me the great power of writing about people who are unknown, that they don't belong to this remote, famous sort of life. So I spent the next 5 years writing this book about Simon. This is just a drawing of Simon. Because I was particularly interested in the way, not just of a genius, but how genius fades, because he had obviously been this great person and it had declined. And I wanted to see why, even despite that decline, he had remained what seemed to me a fundamentally happy man. Here I'd lost, my pathetic little ability. Even my ambitions didn't come close to what he could do in my dreams. But I'd lost it, and it caused me huge amounts of grief. And he had lost it. It seemed he had lost it, ended up in this basement, and he remained contented. So my intention when writing this book had been rather grandly. I thought if I couldn't do the maths myself, perhaps I could get him to do it again. I could take him away from his bus timetables and away from his train timetables and get him back onto doing this extraordinary maths he worked on, which, just for the sake of the resonance, is called monstrous moonshine. It's a type of symmetry. And I could get him doing that again. Now, I have to say I didn't achieve it. He is still resolutely going on buses and trains and not doing a lot of maths. But I do think there were some things I did achieve. And where these sort of came to my notice was in our book launch just the other day. I noticed that his shoulders were a little bit less hunched. And it's not much, but it's a nice thing to feel you may have played a part in that. I noticed that he wasn't carrying his timetable. I felt rather sad about that, but I think, we'd got on very, very well. We'd gone on trips together, and bit by bit, he felt a little bit more relaxed with other people. He'd not been terribly relaxed before. And most of the time, not all the time, now when he walks off, he says goodbye. I think the things he taught me are the things that I feel is one of the things that I inevitably find very moving about writing about people who are unknown. If you get a sort of right person, because you develop this sense of you understand the life they live. It's very like yours. I mean, mine was not the mathematical capacity, but it was definitely the complications he faced every day were the same complications I faced. And the things he taught me were, well, first, my maths books have come round. I've started to get interested in maths again, and they've come round and the spines are now facing out. But I think part of the reason I do that is because he taught me that maths could be a joy, not a competition. And this is what had been his capacity as a mathematician, how he'd managed to preserve his happiness after the talent had gone, that he only did it for the sheer happiness it gave him. And when it ceased to make him happy, but buses made him happier, he simply transferred. And this seemed to me an enormously important lesson to learn, and a lesson that for me was worth 5 years, which is that he conveyed a sort of contentment to me. And I suppose I'd summarize that best in terms of him, who had this enormous capacity and then it faded off, in terms of just accepting you are what you are. Accept it and move on. And this, I think, is the lesson Simon has taught me. Thank you very much.